I was ushered by security up to the 3rd floor and into Charles Koch's office. And he sees me and says, "Oh, Chris, you didn't have to wear a tie to meet with me." You know, he's got this very humble kind of aw shucks Midwestern demeanor to him, but you can't deny the fact that this guy spends his day in the center of a massive corporate empire.
I'm Mary Stack, the director of Cambridge Forum, and tonight we are going to hear about the secret history of Koch Industries and their insidious infiltration into multiple areas of American life. Worth over $120 billion, Koch is one of the largest private companies in the world today. You may not think you support their financial interests, but Koch's vast, sprawling conglomerate undergirds every aspect of modern American life. Koch controls the nitrogen fertilizer that grows your food, the gas that powers your car, the fibers in your clothes, the building material in your home, and the microchips that drive your life online. But it is the stuff you cannot see that is the most troubling. Koch has one of the biggest, most lavishly funded lobbying operations in the country. And the DNA of the Koch ideology raises the whole question of the role of government in the 21st century. Tonight, I'm delighted to welcome the writer who spent 7 years of his life researching the Koch view of the world, Chris Leonard.
So, Koch Industries, Kochland, why do this book? Why would I spend so much time thinking about one company that's privately held, that doesn't get a lot of attention because it doesn't have publicly traded stock? It's never talked about on CNBC. It rarely gets attention. The only degree to which it does get attention is because of the political activities of its owners, David and Charles Koch. But the book, for me, really started with diving into the hidden corporate empire behind David and Charles Koch, the machine that gives them the fortune that they have used to redraw American politics, which is something I'm sure we're going to get to. But for me, the concerns really started on the business front. I'm a business reporter, okay? And so I'm looking for stories that help illuminate what's going on in the American economy and in the American political system. And in late 2011, I just had this kind of aha moment that Koch Industries was this perfect story, this perfect institution, this perfect vehicle to explore the things that were really concerning me as a business reporter. And I'll say why they were so perfect in a second. But first, let me talk about what concerned me. You know, being a business reporter is a funny thing because I hate most business journalism. I don't know where my business went wrong, but it went wrong a long time ago, whereby business reporters felt like we were covering business for other people in business, if you will. The business page is really boring, and it's just all about who's making money and what new products are and what stock is up and what is down. The reporters who inspired me growing up were the muckrakers and the investigative reporters, the people who scrutinized really powerful institutions and unearthed what was going on inside of those institutions to explain them to readers, to explain them to citizens, so that we can simply understand how the machine works, so we can get an accurate map of economic and political power in the country. That's the kind of work that inspired me growing up, and I figured if I was going to cover business, I was going to cover it like my heroes. Ida Tarbell, the woman who wrote the book about the Standard Oil Company, which 100 years later remains a great read with a terrible title, A History of the Standard Oil Company. I recommend it to everybody. And, you know, modern day muckrakers, Seymour Hersh, who tells us what's going on in the CIA, or the great Jane Mayer at the New Yorker, who's also written about the Koch's political network. I cover business in that way, and I saw Koch as this perfect institution to help explain a couple things that were bothering me. The first is the structure of our economy. Okay, we're finishing a decade of economic growth, a decade of uninterrupted economic growth. The employment rate right now is the lowest it's been in 50 years. I think it's still in the 3% range, close to 4%. I mean, this is like 1960s era economic growth, but everybody knows it's not like the 1960s. We've had a decade of growth, and it is inarguable that most Americans haven't advanced economically during those 10 years of growth. You see it every day on the front page of the Wall Street Journal, the Financial Times, you name it. Wages are stagnant. People are taking on debt to cover the rising costs of daily life, the rising complexity of daily life, whether it's dealing with health insurance bureaucracies, paying the mortgage. People are borrowing money to simply stay where they were 10 years ago. And when we face the next inevitable economic downturn, most of us will not have advanced past square one where we were in October 2009. The American economy hasn't always been that way. It hasn't always been that way. And we can talk about the economic history, but back in the 50s and 60s when the economy grew, the gains were broadly shared. And I wanted to know why. Why is that? Why can we grow, but the growth and the gains are captured by this tiny group of people, 400 families, one of them being the Kochs, whose wealth is simply astounding. I remember this one sentence in the book. In 2008, David Koch, his fortune was tiny compared to what it is now. And he passed away, as you know. But even then, it would have taken something, if you earned $300 an hour and you worked 365 days a year, you would have had to work thousands of years to earn how much money David Koch had at that time. And his wealth has grown since. Koch Industries is a great vehicle to start to explore why this is, okay? We just heard from Mary not just how big the company is, okay? This company is enormous. It's privately held, but its annual sales are bigger than that of Facebook, Goldman Sachs, and U.S. Steel combined. That's how big it is. And it's not just big, it's embedded in daily life. It specializes in the kinds of products you depend on every day that you couldn't boycott if you wanted to. Fertilizer, fuel, building materials, clothing materials, the sensors in your phone. Koch is playing in all of these spaces. So that means when you write about Koch, you can write about our energy infrastructure. You can write about blue-collar manufacturing jobs and middle-class workers who work at Koch's Georgia Pacific division that makes brawny paper towels, Dixie cups, building materials. You can look at labor unions and what they have meant for the American economy over the last 50 years and where they stand today. Spoiler, things aren't great. Labor unions are down to like 7% of all private sector workers, and I think it's one of the big reasons why people don't keep the gains of what they earn at work. By writing about Koch, you can talk about derivatives traders and this world of high finance. Koch operates one of the largest global networks of derivatives and commodities trading desks in the world. They don't brag about what they do, but what they do rivals anything on Wall Street, anything operated by J.P. Morgan or Goldman Sachs. I interviewed one individual who's in the book named Brendan O'Neill, who worked at a Koch refinery earning $50,000 a year as an engineer, got transferred to the derivatives desk, and was making $4 million a year trading natural gas options, these abstract derivatives contracts. That helps explain the financialization in our economy and why wealth has become so disparate. When you write about Koch, you can write about private equity deal makers who work inside the company, who reflect this new kind of American capitalism that we could call the private equity economy, whereby they literally buy and sell other companies like they were pawns on a chessboard, like they were shares of stock to be bought and sold. These private equity deal makers can borrow billions of dollars, buy a target company, put the debt on that target company, and then start to slash costs and boost production to pay off the debt, which is borne by the company itself. It's one of the driving forces behind offshoring, pension cuts, wage cuts, automation, you name it. It's this relentless pressure driven by people like that. And then finally, maybe most importantly, one of the things that really concern me that you can write about when you write about Koch is corporate lobbying. I firmly believe, as a business reporter, that corporations hold a place of power over our public life and our public policy that they haven't held in 100 years. Corporate power is at a level today that we haven't seen since the early 1900s, what we call the robber baron era, when life was remarkably similar to where it is today. I'm kind of obsessed with that era, and I read about it all the time, and the stories from the early 1900s are about corruption in Congress, workplace injuries, rampant environmental pollution, corruption in the White House, self-enrichment by politicians. None of this stuff is new, and I would like to point out that we solved these problems in the 1930s. We can leave that discussion, but it's not like this stuff is inevitable. Koch Industries, I think, plays an unrivaled role in corporate lobbying in Washington, D.C. Koch has built a corporate lobbying machine more powerful, I would say, than that of even like Lockheed Martin, Walmart, General Electric. Koch has one of the largest registered lobbying shops in the United States, but it also funds a constellation of think tanks and university chairs that sort of mainstream the Koch ideas. Then Koch has organized a donor network that can raise $800, $900 million during a campaign cycle. That's as much as a political party, the Democratic or Republican actual parties. Sometimes that's as much as they will raise. And finally, Koch has at its disposal a nationwide activist network called Americans for Prosperity, whereby it can get people knocking on doors in neighborhoods around the country, Ohio, West Virginia, Oregon, Nevada, you name it. Americans for Prosperity can have people canvass neighborhoods. It can fill up charter buses full of angry voters and deliver them to the doorstep of specifically targeted lawmakers in Washington, D.C. to press for Koch's case. I don't know of any lobbying machine in Washington that is this multifaceted, this widespread, and this well coordinated, which raises the question, what are they trying to do? What do they lobby for? You know, what's at the root of their vision, the root of the vision for the corporation itself, and the root of the vision for this political machine? Well, to understand that, you have to understand the person who's at the top of the pyramid, who's one of the main characters in the book, who floats over the action for 50 years, and that's Charles Koch. Charles Koch has been CEO of Koch Industries since 1967. He got the job when Lyndon Johnson was president. I don't know of any other major corporation in the United States that's had a single CEO for that long. And Charles Koch has patiently, assiduously, and quite effectively molded this institution to reflect his very specific views of how corporations ought to work. Charles Koch is an ideologue. He is a hardcore free market advocate, let's just call it that. He's a free market acolyte. His dad, Fred Koch, was a co-founder of the John Birch Society, a secret organization that was extremely right-wing, that felt like the federal government had been infiltrated by communists, and that these programs we associate with the federal government, like Social Security and Medicare, were actually sort of front groups and front efforts for communist tyranny. This was the kind of political conversation that would have happened around the Koch dinner table when Charles Koch was young. Charles Koch kind of augmented that point of view by reading these Austrian economists who you might be familiar with, people like Friedrich Hayek and Ludwig von Mises. I always mispronounce their names. I apologize for that. I have read their work, and I know how it influences Charles Koch, and here's the headline. Charles Koch firmly believes he has discovered not only the best way to organize human society, but really the only way you can organize human society, which is as a voluntary market exchange system. Under this view, any government interaction and any government intervention in the market system only causes more problems than it solves. It only causes more harm than good. And that you need to basically reduce government to protecting people's property and serving virtually no other role than that. And then everything else is run by corporations, roads, schools, hospitals, everything. And the push and pull of supply and demand will create a price on everything, a price on healthcare, a price on education. And that's the only real true authority that anybody needs to obey is price, if you will. Because when you start to tamper with that price, you start to interfere in a very delicate system. You start to create distortions, according to this point of view, and you create problems. Charles Koch has been talking about this since the 1970s. In 1974, he gave a speech to a think tank that he created called the Institute for Humane Studies, in which he laid out a plan to make America reflect this view, reflect this political view. You could call it libertarian, he calls it classical liberal, but it's astounding how disciplined they've been over 40 years to execute on the vision that Charles Koch laid out in 1974, to use corporate lobbying, to use litigation, to fund think tanks, to fund education, to slowly push American politics more and more into this sphere of being that reflects this hardcore free market point of view. That being said, I want to say a couple things before I sit down about the reality of Koch Industries. Because when you get down to the nitty-gritty and you get into the business itself, these very clear political ideas that Charles Koch espouses just break down immediately. And it's also really interesting to me how the political debate we all have that we're like swirling in today, you know, red team versus blue team, conservatives versus liberals, when you get down into the actual machinery, all these distinctions, they really do start to break down really quickly. I'm not saying that there's not a difference between the parties. There's a huge difference between the parties. But what I'm saying is I'm put in mind of what a Koch Industries trader told me about how they trade oil. They don't focus on the shiny object. The shiny object is what all the talking heads on CNBC are talking about all day. What they will actually do is get a near real-time transcript of what people are talking about on CNBC and run it through an AI program that can help them determine what the kind of publicly available narratives are, like what people are saying, what people are thinking. And the Koch traders are working one level below that. You know, what people say and what people think is one element, one piece of data that they're going to use to trade oil. But what they're also looking at is the actual functioning of the machinery, the nuts and bolts, the pipelines, the ocean tankers full of oil, the oil refineries. Koch isn't just examining this machinery. Koch operates a huge chunk of it. They own 2 of the largest refineries in the United States. They own hundreds of miles of pipelines. They are involved in global shipping networks of oil every single day. They're learning from every single transaction they make, and they're using that information to trade wisely. And they're not being distracted by the shiny object of what Jay Powell is saying today regarding Donald Trump, which is important. It's important, but what I'm saying is that there's much more to the story. So in the same way that Koch's traders don't get distracted by the shiny object, Koch's political apparatus is not necessarily getting distracted by the shiny object. They're also not falling into the narrative I just talked about of red team versus blue team. I'm going to give you one super quick example. It's very hard for me to talk about this book in a succinct fashion. The first time I sat down with somebody to help me learn how to talk about it, she said, "What's your book about?" And an hour and 15 minutes later, I was like, so that's basically it. Please bear with me if I'm going on for too long. But you know, when we talk about the political realities breaking down, when you get down to the nitty-gritty, Koch's bread and butter today, as diverse as they are, the bread and butter is oil refining and fossil fuels and transporting and selling fossil fuels. You know, I've often told friends while I was reporting this book that we really are in the wrong line of work. We should have been born owning oil refineries, as David and Charles Koch were. It's an incredible business. We all depend on oil. It's a monopoly as an energy source. Now, that is starting to change with these renewables coming up. The picture is starting to change, but for the last 50 years, oil has been a monopoly, fuel source. The United States hasn't built a new oil refinery since 1977. There's virtually no new competition in this business, no new entrant into the market since 1977. Why? Surprisingly enough, it's because of the Clean Air Act, which we passed in the early 1970s, a sprawling, complicated, onerous law that is highly beneficial to everybody because it reduces public health problems and makes our air cleaner. When they passed the Clean Air Act, they grandfathered in, so to speak, all the existing refineries and said, look, you can keep going at your level of pollution right now, but when your refinery breaks down, you got to replace it with something cleaner. Well, the incumbent players, because they could afford the lobbyists, because they could afford the attorneys, they exploited that loophole in the Clean Air Act, and they expanded their existing refineries. None of those refineries got worn out and went out of business. Those are the only refineries that exist today. And they used the Clean Air Act. They used this sprawling regulatory state that Koch complains about every day. They used it essentially as a protector of their profits. They used it as a tool to keep new competitors out of the market. And Koch's own analysts will tell you today that oil refining profits in the United States are higher than anywhere else in the world, and I'm talking by an order of magnitude. The price per barrel in a given year that's in the book was something like $17 a barrel, and the closest competitor was in Europe, where it was $8 a barrel. I mean, that's the gap we're talking about. When you're an incumbent player, when you're the largest of the large, when you're the richest of the rich, you can benefit no matter the political environment. You can exploit the Clean Air Act while also using a free market ideology to quash new competitors in the energy space like wind and solar by calling it crony capitalism, which is exactly what Koch Industries is doing right now as we speak. David and Charles Koch's net worth doubled during the Barack Obama presidency. If Donald Trump is president for 2 terms, I suspect Charles Koch's wealth will double again. We're involved and we're engrossed in a bitter political debate in America right now, and we get nowhere. When the machine is dysfunctional, the people who benefit are the incumbent players, the entrenched players, the Koch Industries. And that's exactly what's happening today. So, with that, I think I'm going to stop talking so I can sit down and we can get into more conversation about what interests you about the company or about the family or about their political activities. But that's sort of the overview of what I was trying to do with the book. Okay, so thank you very much. I appreciate it.
And I think knowing more about these operations is empowering.
I totally agree. Everybody talks about how depressing my books are and how they always end on a really depressing note. And scary is a word that gets used a lot. But when I read investigative reporting, yeah, some of it it antagonizes you. It's kind of disturbing. It can highlight inequities in society. But I always feel really charged up. I always feel really empowered learning about how things work and becoming more informed. And to me, it's a really positive thing. And I'll just tell you as a reporter, this is a company, this is an institution that really didn't want to be written about. Okay, they're privately held. There really is a code of silence. People won't talk to you unless Charles Koch gives them permission. And it was thrilling to me when I could sort of unearth the truth about what was happening. I felt like I was smuggling gold out of Fort Knox, because when you get that internal document, I had somebody share with me, 10 years of internal documents from Georgia Pacific, or when you get that executive to go on the record and tell you the story of what happened. To me, it's thrilling and it is empowering just to learn and just to know.
So there's 2 things there. One is that when Jane Mayer wrote Dark Money, she was quite threatened by them by the Koch brothers.
Yeah.
And you know more about that than I do, but you said that you didn't have that happen to you. Were you ever concerned that you were being completely snowed by these people with their PR?
Yeah. Well, that's a big question. So here's how I look at it, and here's how I see it. Jane Mayer, who wrote a fantastic book called Dark Money that I think came out in 2012, which followed on an article she did for the New Yorker in 2010 that illuminated Koch Industries' political activity, which they had taken really great care to keep secret. Jane was kind of like that first Marine that lands on the beach, and she took flack and a lot of heat. The company had what I would call a regressive public relations team at the time, very hostile, very antagonistic. There's really good reporting, I think, that shows that they hired detectives to trail Jane Mayer. They tried to plant, I think that there's very good evidence that they tried to plant negative stories about her. They attacked her. And my personal assessment is that it blew up in their face. It was in the New York Times, what they did. And I know for a fact that at that time, they overhauled their entire public relations team. As luck would have it, this is when I was deciding I wanted to write about this company. You know, I knew about Jane's work, but what really drew me wasn't the Koch's political activities, but the corporation and the story it told about our political and economic system. And around 2013, 2014, Koch hired a PR team that was, you know, more enlightened. They kind of came from like the tobacco PR background. And that's like literal. They came from doing tobacco PR, and they know that you engage reporters and you let them in. But I guess I have to sort of stand up for my reputation as a muckraker here. Like, when I first started working on Koch, they told me absolutely not. You know, they Googled me, and my first book was called The Meat Racket. And they just said, we're not going to cooperate with you in any form or fashion. So I said, fine, you know, and I flew to Wichita, Kansas, and I spent some pretty miserable weeks knocking on doors and trying to get retirees to talk to me, trying to get mid-level sources at the company to talk to me, started digging through litigation, and just started pushing really, really hard from the outside. And then they would give me some access. So they'd give me an interview or two, and then they would slam the door shut, and I would spend more time working on the story from the outside and the bottom up, and then I would get a little bit of access, and then the doors would close again, if that makes sense. I believe it's very important for all journalists not to depend on access. You want to get these people to talk. I interviewed Charles Koch. I want to know why he does what he does. I want to know how he thinks. But you can't get into a bargain where, you know, your access is dependent on carrying a certain storyline, and you don't get the truth that way anyway. So it's very important to push hard from the outside, and it's very important to start from the bottom up. And I would argue I did that. This is not a PR push for Koch. I've revealed a lot of stuff from inside the company that I know they're not happy is out there, for sure. But I also tried to show really how these people think and really how they do what they do. And at the end of the day, this story is a remarkable story about long-term strategic thinking. I can't overemphasize that. When I talked about Charles Koch having this plan in '74 and sticking with it for 40 years, they're remarkable at doing that. And these are really smart people, and I think anyone would benefit from reading about that and studying what they've done.
So when you do read about it, it reads as though you're looking into the sort of operation of a small autocracy, like a country.
Fair
and
enough.
It's very secret.
Yeah.
And it's a private corporation. So what is their end game? Why isn't he running for president?
Oh, wow. Gosh, there's so much I want to say. First, why isn't Charles Koch running for president? You know how I said I'm obsessed with history a little bit? There was this guy named Andrew Mellon, who is a very Charles Kochish figure who ran all these industrial companies, and he actually became Secretary of Treasury and was helping run the government. Charles Koch is entirely different. There are not pictures on the wall of Charles Koch's office of him with his arm around politicians and doing the rope line handshake. A political operative described it to me as the Charles Koch feels sorry for politicians. He feels like this is true, he feels like they work in a broken system that is completely being torn apart by short-term incentives. In Congress, you're running for re-election every 2 years. You have to beg for money constantly. I've talked to people in the book who had to do that. And, you know, I must hasten to add that Koch Industries plays into that system aggressively and benefits from that dysfunction. But Charles Koch has zero interest, I think, in engaging in actual political action or being elected to office. Instead, what he's focused on his whole life is building this, I think it's fair to call it a mini self-enclosed utopia. It's a free market utopia. That's why I call the book Kochland. This company really is like its own little world. And, you know, Charles Koch has come up with this theory of life. I think it's fair to call it a theory of life called market-based management that started as a management philosophy for how to run the company, but he has made clear it is also the proper philosophy through which you should run a nation and your personal life. Wow. His words, not mine. So market-based management is like gospel within Koch Industries. The 10 dimensions, it's 5 dimensions and 10 principles. The 10 principles are printed on coffee cups in the break room. They're pasted on cubicle walls. When the screens go to screensaver mode, it's the 10 principles of market-based management. When you get hired at Koch Industries, you learn this philosophy during your first 4 or 5 days on the job. You go to the auditorium in the corporate headquarters basement, and you go through breakout sessions and simulations and listen to talks and slideshows, and you learn this philosophy, and as Charles Koch said, you either embrace it entirely or you're out. It's a total conversion. So this company is like a mini society of people who speak their own vocabulary and have their own common incentives and common goals. And you know, your question to me is, what is the end game? It's certainly to make Koch Industries as large and as profitable and as influential as possible. That's been clear since the day Charles Koch became CEO in 1967 when his dad died of a heart attack. And I think Charles Koch has unquestionably succeeded in that goal. The company is enormous now and profoundly profitable. And then I think in terms of how they interact with the rest of the world, I'm a bit torn. I think Charles Koch, if he was sitting here, would tell you that he wants the world to be this free market utopia that von Mises describes, or von Mises, whereby, you know, there's no government malfeasance, you know, meaning like Social Security. There's no government intervention, there's no safety net, there's no taxes, and everybody's prosperous and everybody thrives. But I also think it's fair to say, I said I'm torn. That's what he would say. But I also think maybe there's a lower target that's been set, which is that they simply want to keep the government off their property, if you will, and lobby to the degree that they can keep earning mind-blowing levels of profit every year, if that makes sense. What I'm trying to say is, maybe a more cynical approach whereby they really are lobbying to simply protect the corporation itself and make sure that the laws don't infringe on the corporation's profits.
It sounds very sinister to me. I don't know what it felt like when you walked into the building there, but it sounds like everybody's on something.
It's astounding. It really is. You know, it's so funny. I do hear the word sinister a lot. As a reporter, I'm not trying to dodge it. It's just kind of like amazing to me. It's just amazing to me. When I've read all 3 of Charles Koch's books about market-based management, and it kind of takes my breath away. It is cult-like. That's the word of the executives who worked there, and they joke about it, but I can't tell you how many told me it's sort of like a cult. And to a certain degree, I think that's accurate. But let me, if I could, share like a small anecdote in that the first time I went to Koch's headquarters, when that miserable week I was in Wichita, nobody, the company wouldn't talk to me. I just drove up to the front door and walked in the lobby and said, I want to talk to you. And they sent someone down. When I went back 2 years later, this has nothing to do with me, of course, but they had refurbished the corporate campus. They'd added new buildings, and part of the renovation was they built a 10-foot tall wall around the entire north side of the campus, okay? They diverted a public road in a horseshoe shaped and built a 10-foot tall wall. So it is literally like a walled fortress now. And, to go in, they emailed me a barcode that I scanned at a bunker. The steel gates opened. I drove down a long road back to that parking lot where I'd previously been able to just drive in. I was ushered by security up to the 3rd floor and into Charles Koch's office. And he sees me and says, "Oh, Chris, you didn't have to wear a tie to meet with me." He's got this very humble kind of aw shucks Midwestern demeanor to him, but you can't deny the fact that this guy spends his day in the center of a massive corporate empire that he's largely responsible for building, and that's more profitable every year, which is sort of like this positive feedback loop of validation of his ideas. And I can see why a person like that would think maybe they have figured it out. Maybe they really have cracked the code for how to structure a company and how to structure a society. The one thing I don't detect in Charles Koch is a lot of self-doubt. I think that the people inside Kochland really do believe they're the people who make the world work, and they understand how it ought to be structured.
So this is a question maybe you don't know the answer to, but in terms of ideology,
Yeah.
I know that his father built oil refineries for Stalin at one point, right? And was very shocked and horrified at Stalinism and communism, and some of his friends were killed, I think, by Stalin. Is that right?
That's right.
So he then had this very anti kind of government reaction to that, which he brought back to America with him and instilled in the family, correct?
Correct.
So is there a religious agenda with these people, or where do they sit with their, I'm deserving of all this? I mean, how do they justify it?
Oh, wow. Okay, religion. I've dug through so many archives about Charles Koch, and there was this great profile of him written by the Wichita Eagle, the local paper in the 1990s. And one of his friends mentioned that Charles Koch picked up the Holy Bible in the mid-1990s and read it to see what all the fuss was about. Never talked about it again, okay?
Wow.
This is not like a Christian-focused, evangelical institution in any regard. The people Koch talks about, again, are these libertarian, free market utopian economists like von Mises and Hayek. So it's not religious in the sense you'd think about it.
I only raise that because
Yeah.
Jane Mayer talks about the fact that there's 4 brothers.
Yes.
And there's this great division in the family between 2 and 2.
Yes.
And that one was considered to be homosexual, the eldest. And they brought him into the room, the 3 brothers, and said, if you don't give up your portion of the fortune, we're going to tell Dad. So where did all that come from? Where did that homophobia come from? And what happened to him?
Okay, I'm very confused about how to respond to that because, okay, they're 4 brothers, and they were all raised literally on this compound in Wichita, Kansas, in this kind of Tudor-style mansion where Fred and Mary Koch lived. All these boys from a young age knew that it was on the table that one of them was going to take over the family company. By that point, they were already millionaires. When they were kids, they were millionaires in Wichita, Kansas. And their father imparted to them a really right-wing conservative view of the world. Again, to reiterate, the Birch Society thought most of the federal government was a front group for communist tyranny. This isn't like Social Security is inefficient. It's like the government is evil. Okay. Along with that, it's a given that Fred Koch really encouraged competition among the boys. It was an idea that, you know, you're not going to get this handed to you. The term Charles Koch always uses, you know, you're not going to be a country club bum. You're going to work hard. When Charles Koch misbehaved, he was forced to dig up dandelions in the backyard using a spoon. They couldn't go to the pool during the summertime. The boys literally boxed each other with boxing gloves. So there was a sense of hard work, competition, and drive to really, honestly, to measure up to the old man is my assessment of it. Okay. So when he dies, Charles Koch was only 32 years old, but had already kind of assumed a position of power because that older brother, Freddie, had moved to New York, wanted nothing to do with the family company. I think I would just suffice it to say a fight broke out between the brothers. Charles Koch won and took over the company and split half of it with his younger brother, David. And then the youngest twin, Bill, who had tried to take over, is essentially exiled and never involved again. And, you know, you talk about the culture in Wichita. It is an extremely conservative culture. It's just an extremely conservative culture, I think it's fair to say.
Last question, because I know people will want to come up, and you should start coming up to ask. You mentioned something about this division he has between people being productive and non-productive members of society. It's slightly scary, that idea. It reminds me of like Trump's winners and losers, Margaret Thatcher's views on the free market, that, you know, if you made it, and if there wasn't a job, you got on your bicycle and you found a job. This kind of simplistic view of the world, assuming you had legs and you had a bicycle and all those other things.
Right.
So where does he get this entitlement idea? Does he think he's sort of like Trump from on high?
Here's really how I would put it. I mean, first of all, Charles Koch, and I haven't reported deeply on Trump. I reported a little bit on the Trump White House, but they seem like completely different people in the sense Charles Koch doesn't demean the people who work for him. He doesn't pound on his desk. He doesn't curse. He doesn't yell. But I can't overstate the fact that this guy thinks he has sort of derived the blueprint for how society ought to work. And blueprints, you can't argue with a blueprint. You either build that wall so it's structurally sound or not. And if you try to cut corners, the wall's going to collapse. He sees the world in that same kind of inflexible way. And, you know, I reported a lot on labor unions at Georgia Pacific, which have, like labor unions across the country, have been absolutely decimated in the last 50 years. And Charles Koch's view is that if you are a low-performing employee, you need to be cut. You need to be cut for the following reason, according to this view. If you're allowed to stay at the company, you are going to be using up resources that could be going to a more effective person. You're kind of stealing from the more effective person. And that if a company isn't as profitable as it should be, and it's allowed to exist longer than the market deems it should, it's stealing resources that should be steered toward another better company. And what I'm trying to get at is Charles Koch views this dispassionately. Like, this is the way the world works. And if you argue with the market, you're just pushing a rock uphill, and it's not going to work. And I'm sorry that things are this way, but things are this way. And the market is pitiless in its verdicts. And the book tells stories again and again about how these pitiless verdicts are meted out within Koch Industries. You know, jobs are cut, companies are shed, people are fired. And I guess to your point, it's easy to do when you're born owning the company. You know, maybe you could argue that there's a real blind spot to some pretty difficult realities about how the world works and what happens to somebody when they lose their job and they're out on the street. And, you know, it's not the obligation of big corporations. Well, this is a really interesting point. It's not the obligation of big corporations to think about social stability. They just need to think about earning a profit. And this is like the one of the guiding principles of American capitalism since at least the 1970s. But, you know, I don't know if you are familiar with the quote-unquote Business Roundtable. A lobbying group of corporate CEOs came out just months ago and said we need to rethink this idea. Because I think what they're realizing is that society, not just in America, but around the world, is becoming so unstable. And people are feeling so alienated and feeling like the quote-unquote game is rigged, that it's starting, you know, they've killed the goose that lays the golden eggs. And people are starting to vote for tariffs. You know, it's not inconceivable that they will be voting to raise the corporate tax rate to punitive levels for the richest 400 Americans. So that theory of capitalism is not just being challenged by people, but I think even a lot of business leaders and political leaders are realizing that corporations can't just, you know, avoid the broader responsibilities of their actions.
Good to hear. Okay, please feel free to come and ask some questions.
This reminds me of a bumper sticker I saw, and it said, "Whoever has the most when he dies wins." What really motivates him to keep going at that rate, and what would his epitaph say? What would he like to remain from his efforts? Is this just going to go to one of his children? Nobody hears about them. Or is it just going to stop? Or what is going to be the residue that he hopes will remain from these enormous efforts for a long time? And I note in your criticism of him, there's also faint praise. So you, on the one hand, admire this man and also try to take him down. And so it's, I think, important for you to look critically at the way you look at him and say, when his body is ashes, what's going to remain, and is that of any value? And then you can look back on what you're writing about and saying, is that of any value?
I'll start at the beginning with the question of, I think if I could restate it, what drives this guy to do what he's doing, and what does he want to leave behind? What does he want his epitaph to be? Why has he done what he's done? This is a huge question I've had too. I've asked a lot of people, what makes Charles Koch at the age of 83 get to the office before the sun is up every day? And I don't know what time he leaves, but he's there before the sun is up. And at the end of the book, I have a scene where he's walking into his office, and outside of his office, there's a brass bust of his father on a pedestal right outside his office. He walks past it every morning. His dad ran a company, produced political pamphlets, and raised sons. Charles Koch has surpassed his father's accomplishments by an order of magnitude. He's built a gigantic company. He's formed one of the largest political influence operations in the United States. He's, in fact, cultivated his own son. Charles Koch has a son named Chase, who I think will be CEO of the company one day. I don't think that that is coincidental. I think when you talk about what's driving this guy, it's not the dollar bills, it's not a luxury yacht, it's a sense of accomplishment and proving what he's worth. And I think he would perhaps want his epitaph to say simply builder. I think he wanted to show he's a builder and he didn't just inherit all of this stuff. And then, you know, you bring up a lot of good points. This sounds like such a stupid cliche, but I will tell you, in the book, I do try to get out of the way. I'm not trying to render a verdict on Charles Koch. I want to explain them and describe what they've done and how they work so people can read it and make their own decisions. And I really do try to keep myself off the page. That being said, I'm not going to try to be cute. Yeah, I have my own opinions and I have my own views. You know, when David Koch died, I published an op-ed that day, which felt relatively tasteless to me, saying that his greatest legacy is going to be the fact that, you know, carbon is now 411 parts per million in the atmosphere, that they have lobbied more aggressively than perhaps any other entity in the U.S. to derail greenhouse gas emissions law, That's a grim legacy, and I'm not trying to sugarcoat it, but yeah, I admire a lot of what they've done in the sense that I admire how they operate. You know, as a business reporter, I've covered a lot of grotesque behavior, and the people at the top of Koch do think with long-term strategic thinking. And I think long-term strategic thinking is in desperately short supply in America today. And there's something admirable in how they've done it. Maybe I'll leave it at that.
I was also going to ask about the future, but we've sort of covered that. So I'm also wondering, as I always do at all these forums, what can we do as citizens, you know, if we don't believe that some of the things that they have worked for and set up and tried to dismantle, and, you know, I am concerned about climate change and want something to happen. So how do we counteract and change some of the negativity that has arisen from their business model? What can we do?
Mimic their strategy, maybe.
Well, mimic their strategy, which is really hard advice to give to your typical middle-class American who's working extremely hard and then has to get home and take care of kids and get back to work the next day, try to stay out of debt. Because here's one thing I would say. I just have a big, complicated mess of stuff to say because there's no easy answer to your question. But the first thing I would start with is, you know, when I wrote about the political sections of this book, I knew corporate power and politics was going to be a big thing, and I thought I'd be writing about campaign donations and super PACs and all that stuff. I was 100% wrong. All of the political chapters in this book start the day after the election. And that's when all the attention, all the eyeballs start to drift to other stuff. And then the actual mind-numbingly boring business of governing starts to take place. And that's where Koch leverages its expertise. It is there every single day in the halls of Congress, in the courts, in the halls of the state legislatures, in the administrative agencies, EPA, OSHA. And so, I mean, one thing I want to say to people is, let's say you disagree with the Koch agenda, you need to stay engaged after the election and be on point when these important but obscure and highly boring governmental actions are taking place. But then I feel bad saying that to people because we barely have time to read the newspaper. And this is a big thing, that concentrated wealth always has an advantage over workers and middle-class people. And it's a structural thing. So maybe if I could please answer it this way. What could we do? What could an individual do? The United States faced remarkably similar problems to this in the 19-teens and in the 1920s. Dramatically concentrated wealth, terrible corruption, environmental pollution, worker safety concerns. And the populace confronted these issues through the political process. This sounds so partisan, but they really did. They elected FDR. Yeah. They elected a Democratic Congress. They passed a sweeping series of laws called the New Deal, which were passed over a decade that contained a lot of these problems. So I think it's not a simple thing of try to reduce your, I mean, it's very important to try to reduce your carbon footprint, but a broad public policy response is necessary to deal with a lot of these problems, which is a really unsatisfying answer.
Thank you very much for a very good book. A couple of things, though, I'm still curious about. In response to this last question, it seems to me there are a whole series of things that can be done that you didn't explore, including things like Unkoch My Campus, for example, a nationwide organization that's trying to look at the ideological sub-story that's taken place through hundreds of campuses, thousands of student groups, funded entirely by the Kochs, in order to build the ideological momentum behind this, what you kept calling free market ideology. I'm surprised you didn't penetrate in a bit that free market ideology, because though he would like that to be called that, Charles, it has nothing to do with a market being free. It has everything to do with capturing government in order to make it work for his corporation. I'm a little mystified for that reason, that you admire him in some respect for what you call his long-term vision. It doesn't take anything more than a third-grade biology student to realize that extinction is not good for business in the long run.
What's not good?
Extinction.
Extension.
Extinction.
Oh, I misheard.
There
thought you
are
said extinction.
thousands of people on the street daily pointing this out. It's hardly a long-term problem any longer. If the Kochs or anyone else that he seems to be funding in the quote-unquote free enterprise ideology of the economics professors he's had named in one university after another, had any notion whatsoever about the long term or even the short term, they'd realize that the ideologies they're pursuing are absolutely suicidal.
I'll answer the last part first. You know, please, the book does not pull punches about the climate crisis facing the world. And I very intentionally included a 3-page overview of the indisputable science around climate change, because Koch has spent decades patiently dismantling the public debate around that and trying to cast doubt on climate science. And
So you gave it 3 pages.
what's that?
So you gave it 3 pages?
I did.
I see.
3 pages of walking through the climate science, because I wanted the evidence to be indisputable for the libertarians who read the book, that maybe I could reach Koch people to help walk through some of the science that they deny. Now, I gave maybe 100 pages to the fight over climate change regulation in Washington, D.C. A lot of space in the book to fight over the Waxman-Markey bill and Donald Trump. It's all in there. I don't think I'm pulling any punches about the effect that this is going to have on the world. And so, you know, your first thing was about Unkoch my campus and the efforts that are happening to expose Koch funding of thinkers on college campuses, push back against it, and reduce it. I totally understand what you're saying. What was going through my brain when I answered that question was the bigger picture, national scale. How do we change the economy so that income inequality is not so dramatic, so that corporations don't have such outsized lobbying power in Washington, D.C., and so that corporations don't write our laws? And again, I go back to the history of the New Deal and other big public policy approaches we've taken.
I see. Well, one of the things that we're very proud of here in the Boston area is the contribution of a place like WGBH, which regularly comes up with programs like NOVA that are funded in large part by the David H. Koch Fund for Science, which in every respect has nothing to do with science, but has a lot to do with raising public support for the Koch agenda. Did you discuss that at all?
I did. And so here's how I see it, is that during the fight between the brothers, David and Charles Koch formed something of a truce. It was the most consequential decision David Koch ever made in his life, which was to side with Charles Koch. And they decided to split the ownership of the company 50-50 between themselves. They basically together owned 80%. But Charles Koch ran the company, and he also ran the political network. David Koch moved to New York and lived the life of a high-profile billionaire. And part of that lifestyle is public philanthropy, giving money to museums, giving money to public television stations, having your name on cancer research centers. And so David Koch did all of those things that Charles Koch avoided because he's so private. And ironically, David Koch became much more of a better-known public figure, even though he was not nearly as involved in running the company. So I think that's what describes a lot of his philanthropic activity. So thanks for your question. I think someone has one right behind you.
Good.
I wanted to appreciate the question about what folks can do in response to the philosophy and the situation you described, and I appreciate your answer about staying involved after the election, and also your appreciation for how difficult that is. I want to just make the statement that one way to do that is to have the same long-term investment view that the Kochs do, and invest in the organizations that are responding. So make donations and volunteer for. So I happen to be on the board of the Massachusetts Rivers Alliance. We are tiny. We are challenging the Trump administration's huge pushback on the Clean Water Act. And so that's one way I think we can respond in the same arena that he's playing. So challenging the regulations, challenging the regulatory rollbacks. My question for you is, it almost sounds as if the religion, if there is a religion, is just anti-government in the Koch family. And I'm curious about whether there are any exceptions. Are there any places where some of the traditional justifications for government regulation, like food safety or I guess food safety is a good example. Are there any places where he makes exceptions and sees a role for the government, or is it really just the market can take care of absolutely everything?
Everything I've read, everything I've seen indicates literally the market will take care of everything. The government is there to protect property and to settle legal disputes.
And that's it.
And that's it.
Wow.
Now, I wish Charles Koch was sitting here to answer your question. And as I told you, I got to interview him once, but only for an hour. And I put a lot of questions to Charles Koch that they wouldn't allow him to talk to me about, including his real views on climate change. He's a scientist with 3 master's degrees from MIT. He knows how to read data. Surely he knows the scope of this problem. Another issue I've never been able to ask him about is the political endgame that you're discussing. Okay, fine. Let's say he's a tyrant of America. What is the federal government going to look like? No FAA, no food safety inspections. Is that really the reality that we're going to have? I know that right now he's working on a book that will talk about applying market-based management to society as a whole. So, you know, we can look forward to reading that, I suppose, and figure out what his prescription for American politics really is. But from everything I've read so far, every speech he's given, yes, the idea is that the market will solve these. And let me hasten to add, this isn't the political point of view that I happen to embrace, but it's also my job as a reporter to tell you what these people think, what they believe, and why they're doing what they're doing. I haven't been able to report on every Koch political activity around the country. They're involved everywhere. But I think that what's revealed in the book is the blueprint, the core blueprint for how they operate and what they do.
It's very enlightening. Thank you.
Thanks.
Thank you very much. This has been really interesting and, as Mary said, depressing. On the other hand, I'm an academic and an activist, and I teach negotiation and leadership. And in negotiation parlance, information is power. So you've given us a lot of information which could potentially be powerful in our leadership going forward. You have repeatedly mentioned the New Deal as a way of dealing with the situation 100 years ago. We have a Green New Deal on the table now. You have said that it doesn't, I think you said, that it doesn't much matter who's running for office. Maybe I misheard you. I think it does matter who's running for president, and I'm wondering what you think about the Green New Deal as a potential to address the depressing information that you've delivered, and if you think there are any presidential candidates that might be able to leverage the Green New Deal?
I am extremely worried that it came across that I said it doesn't matter who gets elected as president, because I believe the opposite of that. It really does matter. Sometimes I talk too fast, and I think what I said earlier was, I'm not saying both parties are the same, and I'm not saying that it doesn't matter who wins elections, but I am saying that most of the political debate on cable television and what's in the newspapers is the so-called shiny object. It matters, and it's important, but there's an entire level of activity going on beneath the surface that doesn't get covered that's very important to pay attention to. Yeah, it dramatically matters who wins the White House. That lesson is more apparent today than ever for everybody, no matter what your political party is. So this is embarrassing, but as a reporter, I have to tell the truth. I haven't actually read the Green New Deal. I haven't read the legislation. I've read about it, and I suppose my plea of mercy to the court is that I was finishing the book when the Green New Deal was released, and I was dealing with Koch Industries. In February, I gave them like 260 pages of material to respond to be fair. And that was an involved, antagonistic process that required a really close focus on detail.
Well, we can let you off the hook a little bit here, because tomorrow night, Naomi Klein is going to be here.
Oh
and
my
her
God,
new
that
book
is the
is
best.
exactly on this topic, On Fire, the Green New Deal. So anyone who wants to learn more about that, it's actually sold out, tomorrow night's forum, but it will be recorded by GBH and NPR, so you will have a chance to hear more about it. So you can even tune in, Chris, if you have a time to
Yeah,
hear what
thanks
that-
for the save
Yeah.
on that. I appreciate it.
Can you come very quickly to the microphone, because we've got a book signing.
So when you put the 260 pages to Prince Charles and the Empire, how did they react?
To give Koch's, and I failed to mention that earlier. They've never tried to intimidate me. I have seen no hostile actions from them. We had a back and forth over the material. I did change a couple things that I had gotten wrong, and that's why I do fact-checking. But then things got increasingly antagonistic as the process went on, when they realized that I wasn't going to change things in the book just because they were unhappy with them, if you will, or that they disputed ideas that were like clearly, in my view, completely supported by the evidence. So it got pretty antagonistic. We had some pretty loud phone calls, and then, then they have effectively gone radio silent, to me, more or less, since the book came out.
The reaction was from Charles himself?
No. I deal with Koch's public relations team. They walled off Charles Koch to me pretty quickly when they saw like the 260 pages of material of what was going to be in the book.
Well, I'm sure we could talk quite endlessly about this topic, but I would like to thank you, Chris Leonard, for writing what I think is an amazingly thorough book about Koch Industries, and for taking part in tonight's live presentation. So we're all very grateful for your time and knowledge, and we could applaud that.
All right, thank you. I appreciate it.